Hello everyone, I'm Marie. Today, I'm hoping to get a clearer understanding of the sociology of racism. I've invited Plato to help explain these complex concepts to me.
I'm happy to be here, Marie. I'm Plato, and I've been delving into this abstract on the sociology of racism. It's a fascinating field that examines the intricate relationship between racism, racial discrimination, and racial inequality. I'll do my best to break it down.
Thank you, Plato. The abstract mentions a shift from focusing on overt racist attitudes to more subtle structural processes. Could you explain what that means and why it's important?
Certainly, Marie. Think of it this way. Older studies might have focused on explicit individual acts of prejudice, but contemporary sociology recognizes that racism isn't just about individual beliefs. It's also about systems, structures, and even subtle, everyday processes that often without conscious intent continue to create racial inequality. It's like understanding that a leaky faucet isn't just about the faucet itself, but also the plumbing system behind the wall.
That's a helpful analogy. So it's not just about someone being overtly prejudiced, but also about how societal structures might perpetuate inequality even if people aren't consciously trying to be racist. And how is race itself understood in this context?
Exactly. And that brings us to the definition of race. The abstract highlights that, among social scientists, race is understood as a social construct. While physical differences like skin color exist, they don't inherently determine abilities or behaviors. Historically, the concept of race has been used to categorize people, and in the Enlightenment era, it took on a biological meaning to justify domination. But the scientific consensus today is that race, as a biological category, is meaningless for humans.
So, race is a human-made category, not a biological reality. And racism, from a sociological perspective, is an ideology of racial domination. Could you elaborate on that? And how it differs from racial discrimination and inequality?
Precisely. Racism, as the abstract puts it, is an ideology of racial domination, where one group's perceived superiority is used to justify the inferior treatment of others. Racialization is the process of creating these racial categories based on perceived differences. Racism occurs when these categories are then valued hierarchically. Now, racial discrimination is about unequal treatment, like denying someone a job because of their race. Racial inequality, on the other hand, is about the unequal outcomes, differences in income, education, or health. While racism often leads to both, current inequalities aren't always a direct result of current racism. The sociology of racism investigates how these three, racism, discrimination, and inequality, interact and reproduce each other.
That distinction is really important. It sounds like the field has evolved significantly. The abstract mentions two phases, one focusing on overt attitudes and another on more subtle, implicit, and systemic forms. Can you walk me through that intellectual history?
Yes, that's a key point. The first phase, from the late 19th to mid-20th century, largely viewed racism as individual-level attitudes. Many social scientists of that time, unfortunately, held racist views themselves and incorporated them into their work. It wasn't until around the 1920s, and more significantly after World War II, that sociologists began to see racism as a distinct social problem. Even then, the focus was often on explicit prejudice, seen as a relic that would fade with societal progress, like in theories of immigrant assimilation.
So, in the early days, it was more about individual bad apples, and the expectation was that as society became more enlightened, racism would naturally disappear.
That's a good way to put it. However, the abstract points out that even as overt racism declined, racial inequality persisted. This led to the second contemporary phase, starting around the mid-20th century. This phase emphasizes critical and structural analyses, looking at how racism operates at both micro and macro levels, including implicit biases and institutional practices. It acknowledges that historical and systemic forms of racism interact with other social forces to perpetuate inequality.
That makes sense. If overt racism is less common but inequality remains, we need to look for other explanations. The abstract mentions new racisms like symbolic or colorblind racism. What are those?
Those are crucial concepts for understanding contemporary racism. Symbolic racism, for instance, describes a blend of genuine belief in democratic principles with underlying stereotypes and resentment towards racial groups. Laissez-faire racism is similar, where people blame minority groups for their own problems despite supporting racial equality in principle. And colorblind racism refers to how people explain or justify the racial status quo without explicitly sounding racist, often by framing issues in ways that ignore race's impact.
It sounds like these new racisms are about maintaining racial hierarchies through more indirect or coded language. And what about implicit bias?
Implicit bias refers to unconsciously held beliefs or attitudes about a group. The abstract explains that these biases, often measured by tools like the implicit association test, can affect our actions and judgments without our conscious awareness. So, even if someone explicitly believes in racial equality, their unconscious biases might still lead to discriminatory behavior in subtle ways, like nonverbal cues or even how they interact with people from different racial groups.
So it's like having a hidden program running in the background that influences our decisions. The abstract also discusses racism as a social process and institutional racism. How do these fit in?
Excellent questions, Marie. Racism as a social process looks at how racial meanings are constructed and maintained over time. Racialization is a key term here. It's the process of creating racial categories and assigning meaning to them. This can happen at a macro level through institutions like the census, or at a micro level through everyday interactions and how we present ourselves. Institutional racism, on the other hand, focuses on how policies, practices, and norms within organizations and systems, even if not overtly racist, systematically disadvantage certain groups. Think of a company's hiring practices that, unintentionally, say the candidates from certain neighborhoods or educational backgrounds that are predominantly white.
So institutional racism is about the rules of the game being set up in a way that perpetuates inequality, even without explicit racist intent. It's like a game where the board is slightly tilted, making it harder for some players to win.
That's a perfect analogy, Marie. And the abstract also touches on responses to racism, looking at how those who experience racism navigate and resist it. It highlights that the targets of racism often have unique knowledge and perspectives that can challenge dominant narratives. It's about understanding not just the perpetuation of racism, but also the agency and strategies of those affected by it.
This has been incredibly illuminating, Plato. It seems the sociology of racism has moved from a focus on individual prejudice to a much broader understanding of how racism is embedded in social structures, processes, and even unconscious biases. The key takeaway for me is that while overt racism is condemned, its legacy and more subtle forms continue to shape racial inequality.
You've grasped it perfectly, Marie. The field's evolution reflects a growing recognition that understanding and combating racial inequality requires a multivalent approach, looking at everything from individual attitudes to systemic structures and the very construction of race itself. It's a complex but vital area of study.